In this video, I'm gonna be talking about gear. More specifically, I'm gonna be going over some of the overarching themes and questions that come up when it comes to figuring out what type of equipment you want to acquire. Now, it can be a little intimidating. I'm not gonna lie, when I first got into photography, I looked at lenses and camera bodies, and there's so many statistics and numbers and measurements going on that you're like, what do I even want to buy here? And when the prices start to get into the thousands of dollars, you really don't want to make a mistake. So throughout this course, I'm going to go through and show you just the essentials, everything you need to know to really get a grasp on what kind of gear you need for what kind of situation. With that being said, I'm not going to go through and promote any type of brands or products in particular. A lot of them are honestly fairly similar, and if you do really want to see what I am exactly shooting with at the moment, you can go on my website to intricateexplorer.com/equipment, and there's a live list that I keep updated as I get rid of and acquire new gear at any time. But like I said, I'm not going to be pushing for any of those products within this course. I'm just going to give you an overview. So let's go ahead and start with some of the main questions that come up when it comes to gear. And the first question that always comes up is, does gear matter? And the answer to this question is yes, it does. A lot of photographers will go through and say, gear doesn't matter, you can shoot with anything and get good photos if you're a good photographer. But at the end of the day, gear unlocks a whole new different type of photo that you can get if you don't have the proper gear. So essentially, it brings in new possibilities. Let me give you a few examples. So for example, if you're shooting with a lens that is, say, 24mm, you're really only going to be able to shoot wide landscapes. However, if you have a lens that's 200 to 600mm, you're going to be able to get a much more zoomed length on things and be able to shoot things like birds, animals, or mountains from really far away. So that's a solid example right there of how there's simply photos you can't get if you don't have the right type of gear. Another example is dynamic range. And we're gonna get into this, we're gonna get into what that lens measurement thing was in other videos. I'm just giving you a basic overview here. So back to dynamic range. So dynamic range in easy terms is essentially light and darkness within a photo. So if you have a camera with a sensor that has a really big dynamic range, this means you're going to be able to shoot in more low light situations and get a higher quality photo. So for example, if you're shooting at concerts or you're shooting at twilight when the sun's gone and it's a lot darker out, you're going to be able to get much more crispy and clear photos that have a beautiful color range in them compared to shooting with a lower dynamic range camera. So that's another example of how gear can open more possibilities. Another example, just to top this off, is filters. If you don't have a ND filter, it's extremely difficult to shoot waterfalls and get that nice blurry line that makes so many waterfalls look surreal and amazing. So those are just a few examples of how gear matters. However, the important distinction here is that price isn't always a factor here. And a lot of times camera companies and YouTube review channels will give you the illusion that higher priced items can give you higher quality photos. This is not true. So for example, I shoot with Sony. And you will notice that in the Sony world, there's lenses that are of the G Master quality, which compare in a lot of similar ways to lenses by Tamron and Sigma in terms of quality, except since they're the G Master luxury lenses, they almost have $1,000 more price increase on a lot of those products. So price doesn't necessarily matter, reviews matter. So my biggest advice with gear is look for the prices and the reviews in correlation, because you can find a lot of extremely high quality gear that's much cheaper there on the market that unlocks all of those possibilities so you can get a wider range of shots. One final aspect of this does gear matter portion of the course is brands. A lot of people say, well, does Sony matter versus Canon versus Nikon or Olympus or Fuji? And the easy answer is that no, it doesn't. For the most part, all of these brands are fairly similar because they're very well known and popular on the market. So unless you're trying to get very specific or you want to be a fanboy of a certain lens, for example, I shoot Sony entirely because I played PlayStation as a kid. I don't even have a legitimate reason for doing it. That's just what I started with. And now everything I own is Sony. And this would be my advice to you. Pick a camera brand that you like and stick with it. Because once you start to acquire lenses, you're gonna want them to fit to the same camera body, and you're not gonna wanna have to buy multiple lenses to fit for multiple camera bodies. So just stick to one brand throughout probably the next 10 to 15 years, unless you're a wealthy person that is able to just buy a ton of camera brands right off the bat and experiment. Stick with one in particular. The second question that comes up is, should I take the time to study gear in detail? And by this I mean watch YouTube videos, watch reviews, read all of those things that pop up online, the latest camera body, the latest features. My answer is no. Don't get sucked into this subculture in the photography community. For the most part, it is a waste of time, and it's just gonna bring so much money out of your pocket because you're always gonna feel like you wanna keep buying new gear. And a lot of what these YouTube channels and these companies do is they make you feel like you're not gonna be able to get a good photo unless you're buying the newest and the latest and the most high-tech gear. So don't even bother looking at that stuff. The only time you should be watching YouTube reviews on what kind of products to get are at the very beginning of your photography career or later on when you're thinking of acquiring a bunch of new gear because you want to take your photography to the next level and you feel like you're being held back. So don't get sucked into watching that. It can become a mental hindrance and you'll often not go out because you'll be just watching videos about what camera body you should buy next. One last point I want to make in this question is I wouldn't recommend bringing up gear when you talk to other photographers. It can be a bit of a sore topic because not everyone has the same budget, not everyone is shooting with the same things, and it's kind of a bragging competition at a certain point when you walk up to someone and the first thing you say is, what kind of camera are you shooting with? What kind of lens are you shooting with? It doesn't really matter. I think the main questions you should be asking are, what photos did you recently take so you could actually see their skill level, and perhaps giving advice about where to go shoot or sharing stories about some crazy photos you've got. That is the way to approach other photographers, not initially talking about gear right off the bat because it just gives it a bad vibe right off the bat. So don't be that guy that just starts talking about gear when you meet someone for the first time. All right, the third question and final question that comes up all the time is, what gear should I be shooting with at the start? And honestly, I think there are 3 different levels to your gear acquisition process. First off, I would start with a phone. For the first 9 months of my photography career, I shot entirely with a Google Pixel and one of those Joby Gorilla Pods that I could use as a tripod. Super easy, and it really will tell you if photography is for you because you're stuck with essentially one focal length, not many options to work with. I mean, a lot of newer phones nowadays are starting to get a bit more complicated and give you more settings to get into, but for the most part, phones are fairly limited, and if you can get really good at shooting with your phone, then it means you're ready to take your process to the next level. So once you do that, get to level 2, which is where I would say get a crop sensor camera body and maybe a few lenses to experiment with. And I'll get into details about what a crop sensor lens is a little bit later in this course in the camera body section, but just know that you kind of want to get something that's in the $1,000 range for the camera body and maybe $1,000 or $2,000 for a couple lenses, and start to experiment with those and see how it's different than a camera on your phone. From there, once you start to get comfortable with that, I would begin to acquire more lenses and eventually work your way up into the 3rd tier of process acquisition, and that would be with expensive camera bodies. This is where you're gonna get into camera bodies that are $3,000 plus and probably start to get a lot of lenses that are in the $1,000 range. I wouldn't recommend starting with that category right off the bat unless you have a lot of money to blow. I would just ease into it a bit with the phone, the APC crop sensor mirrorless camera, a few lenses, and then eventually get into the very expensive camera bodies. Once you know that photography is what you want to do, when you want to take it to the next level and perhaps start getting even better photos. So that is the 3 main questions that I wanted to cover in the gear world. The main takeaway here is don't get too caught up in gear. You really want to spend your time out shooting, spend the time a little bit to get to know what kind of gear you're going to get, which I'm going to cover in this course. But once you get your gear, spend time learning art techniques, looking at other artists, reading stories about how people are getting photos, and spend time in that world. Don't spend time in the latest camera Sony body has this feature. Don't get caught up in that world. It's simply going to hold you back. Trust me. All right, so let's jump into the next video where I'm going to talk about camera bodies in specific detail.